welcome. Today is our Relax into Health, Wealth, and Happiness meeting. It's nice to have you here. And today, the topic is the importance of self-care for all good purposes in your life. So whether you want to be successful in your career, or you want to be successful in your physical well-being, or you want to be successful in relationships with others, you want to be successful mentally, you want to be successful emotionally, you want to be successful spiritually. If you want to, if you have lofty goals like spiritual enlightenment, self-care is important. And this is something that I think is very poorly understood, generally speaking. And so we'll explore this together today, and I will help you to understand what self-care actually is and why it's important, and importantly, how you can begin to actually exercise and practice self-care so that you can receive all of the benefits of self-care. Now, to start, this is Relax into Health, Wealth, and Happiness. And so it's important that you have the right understanding of how you can receive the what's available through this meeting. And it's in the title of the meeting, to relax into health, wealth, and happiness. And it's important that you understand what that relaxation is. So it's an active relaxation, which means that you have to be present. And it's very, very important. It's the most important thing. The rest of it is a distant second importance, because if you are not engaging in the proper way, then you can't actually receive what's available. A lot of the time we are trained to believe that we just need to gather enough information. If we could just get all of the information, then somehow that would add up to what it is that we want. But perhaps you've noticed that hasn't worked out. There's so much information available, and in fact, the amount of information is overwhelming, and it actually works counter to what it is that we want, because then we feel often that we're missing out on some essential information, and we need to work harder to get more information. But that of course produces anxiety. So here it's very essential that you understand that the most important thing is the direct experience. It's really the only thing that matters. If you understand something intellectually, then it really doesn't do you any good in and of itself. I had some recent experiences in which it was made clear to me that artificial intelligence understands me better than I understand me. And that's not really an exaggeration, but artificial intelligence is artificial. It's soulless. There's no life there to receive any benefit. And so the intellectual understanding, the ability to comprehend and synthesize information in and of itself really does no good at all. But what is of essential importance is the ability to actually receive. Because what it is that you truly want is already here. It's already available. It's already who you are. But you're not in the habit of receiving it. In fact, you're in the habit of rejecting it. And so it's the receiving that's the important thing. And so this active relaxation is so that you can receive this already present truth that you are. So in order to experience this, I want to briefly guide an experience or practice for you. So if it's comfortable, close the eyes. If it's not comfortable, you needn't close the eyes, but closing the eyes is helpful because it will help to reduce what we think of, at least as external stimulation, and it will allow for a more interior, centered attention. And just notice your breathing. And the breath is happening. And there's a certain mechanical quality to it because we are usually quite mechanical. So we want to allow, through attention and awareness, just allow for the mechanical overlay to soften so that the underlying intelligence can be revealed. So just notice the breath and notice where there's some rigidity or some kind of artificial mechanical quality where there's a lack of spontaneity and where there's a failure to allow for the breath to actually be its own natural expression. So just notice, of course, there's an inhalation and then an exhalation, and this rhythm follows, but the length of each inhalation and the length of each exhalation, if we allow it, is actually spontaneous. It's completely responsive to this moment, and this moment is always fresh. So just notice that. Notice that the depth of each inhalation and the depth of each exhalation varies if you allow it. The speed of each inhalation and the speed of each exhalation varies if you allow it. So just relax and open and allow for the breath to occur. And the location in which the breath is experienced will also shift over time so that it's not held rigidly in one location, but it shifts. Now you might notice other content, thoughts might occur or sensations, images might appear. And that's natural and fine, but you can notice that you have the ability to allow your attention just to rest on the breath. out of habit, you might give your attention to some of the content, but you can choose just to relax and allow your attention just to rest with the breath, just noticing the spontaneity of it, the intimacy of the experience. So when it's and if it's you have a desire to open the eyes, you're welcome to do so. Or if you prefer to keep them closed, that's fine too. But the idea here is just to notice that there's already an intelligence that's doing everything. And all you have to do is simply be aware of it. This is really that's the whole lesson in a sense. So if you get it, if you really deeply recognize that and receive that and value that, then that's all. There's nothing else that's needed. There's the rest of it is an unnecessary complication in that case. And I mean that sincerely. You can, if you really see this, then you'll see that this is already taking care of everything. And all of the sense that you need to do something or understand something or figure something out or get somewhere is just unnecessary. Because the most fundamental, there's this sort of two fundamental, we'll say, qualities. And we could talk about them in many different ways using different language, but I'll describe them as awareness and aliveness. Now, they're not separate, of course. They go together. You can never have one without the other. But it seems maybe as though there's this awareness quality that has this unmoving nature. It's completely still. It's limitless. There's no boundary to it. And then this aliveness seems to have be imbued with activity and energy. So we could also describe them as stillness and dynamism, or silence and sound. However you want to understand them, it doesn't really matter. But notice these two fundamental qualities are just all already given. They already are here. There's no need for you to do anything or even to exist as some kind of separate entity. This is already the fulfillment of everything. It's the source and the destination of everything. So you could, if you were so inclined, you could just choose to explore this for the rest of your life. Just inquire into this for the rest of your life and learn to trust it. Learn to discover the the truth of it in every moment, to see that really there's nothing required of you other than what is already given. Again, just to reiterate that what's given is awareness and aliveness. And you can't separate yourself from this. You are aware and you are alive. You don't always recognize that though, because the attention goes to these other things. Now, these other things, the thoughts and the ideas and the sensations and all of these other things, they're not separate either. You can see perhaps that nothing can exist independent of awareness, and that all of these other things that we understand as being distinct phenomena, they're not separate from this aliveness. They're like sparks of aliveness. So again, all of it comes down to this awareness and aliveness. That's the most fundamental, and it's inalienable. You can't separate yourself from it. You can't lose it. But you can get distracted. You can become deluded. You can put your attention on the more differentiated aspects and fall under this hypnosis in which you believe that you have to do all these things. So for that level, when we're deluded, we need some other support to point us in the right direction so that we can learn to really trust and inquire into this fundamental nature of awareness and aliveness. But again, the recognition directly, the direct experience of this awareness and aliveness is the foundation. Without this, everything else just becomes intellectual delusion. It has to be grounded in this aliveness and awareness. So for those who have just joined, you missed out on we literally just concluded the most important thing. I'll briefly recap. The direct experience is essential, and the direct experience is the intimate recognition of awareness and aliveness. So just take a moment to notice that everything is coming and going in and as this aliveness and awareness, and that there's no separate you that needs to get that or achieve that, because this aliveness and awareness is the source of everything, and you are already intimate with it. So that's the act of relaxation, just to allow your attention to come to rest here as much as possible. And as I said, if you can do that and make that the activity of a lifetime, then that really is everything that's needed. Sincerely, there's nothing else needed. That will give you everything. Now, of course, your mind might say, well, but I want all of these things, and I'm not sure how this resting attention with awareness and aliveness can give me all the things that I want, because I want to have, I want to have six-pack abs, and I want to have $1 billion, and I want to have, I want to be the most popular YouTuber on the planet, and I want to, be adored by everybody, and I want to be able to climb Mount Everest, naked and whatever. I mean, whatever. I mean, those are obviously exaggerated and stupid desires, but but we have all of these kinds of desires that we think we need to have fulfilled. And so now for the lesson of self-care. Because we have all these desires, and the desires are not bad. The desires are, as I've already suggested or pointed out, they're also divine. They're sparks of this aliveness. But the attachment to them is what produces the suffering and the delusion. And we can't simply detach. Once the attachment is there, there has to be a fulfillment. This is the tricky part, because a lot of, or at least some, I don't know about a lot, but some spiritual teachings will say, make this point. They'll say the attachment to the desires is the problem, it's the cause of all suffering. And then the solution is either made explicit or it's left implicit, which is get rid of all of the attachment to desire. But it's not usually very clear how that can be done. And so the result is usually suppression. And unfortunately, that doesn't work very well. And so that's a misunderstanding of this lesson of self-care. So in order to set this up, I want to talk about, or briefly give a synopsis of the story of Siddhartha, who becomes Buddha. So Siddhartha is born a prince, and the king, the father, has, as was done in those days, and presumably there were some royal astrologers or gurus or whoever who were able to divine the destiny of this child, and they made a prophecy, and they said, this child is destined for greatness, and his path will be one of two. Either he will become a great leader, and sort of not really an either or, we find out, but he'll be a great leader, or he'll renounce the world. And the king says, well, no son of mine is going to renounce the world. We can't have that happening. He has to be a great leader like me. And so the king is advised that in order to help ensure that the son won't renounce the world, he has to be sheltered. In particular, he has to be sheltered against these three things: old age, sickness, and death. These are apparently the worst things. And so he has to be sheltered from these. So he's sheltered from them, and he's never allowed to see any of these things. And one day, it's his birthday. I don't know how old he is at this point. He's a bit older. And it's his birthday, and he says, gee, Dad, what I want for my birthday this year is I want to go outside of the palace walls. I want to see the world out there. Because he's never been out. He's been sheltered, and his father's, got cold sweats all of a sudden. He's like, how are we going to arrange this? It's okay. So he says to all his servants, he says, look, we're going to arrange for this parade. We're going to take my son out. And you have to organize things so that on the parade, he only sees beautiful things. He cannot see sickness, old age, or death for sure. And so they make all the arrangements and organize things. And it's all, fairly fake. And but as fate would have it, he sees sickness, old age, and death out there in the great wide world. They couldn't prevent it. And so now he's disillusioned, and he realizes that there's more to life than this sheltered existence. So he sneaks away, and he goes and finds these renunciates, and he joins them, and he does their very strict penance. They stand on, standing on one leg kind of thing, and starving themselves basically. And he gets to a point where he is just he's skin and bones, and he has this realization, which is, I haven't found what I'm looking for, and this path is not likely to lead me to it. And so he leaves the ascetics, and I think he accepts a cup of milk or something. I can't remember the exact details, but so he's not gonna starve himself, but he realizes he's desperate for truth. And so there's these two ways that he's gone about it. You know, the one way, which is the ignorance, to be kept in ignorance, which is what most of us think of as self-care. You know, we try to avoid the things that make us uncomfortable. And then the rejection of that is this self-rejection, rejecting the body, rejecting comfort. So these two extreme poles. And he realizes, okay, neither of those has worked, but he's, again, desperate for truth. So he goes and he sits under the Bodhi tree, and he makes a firm resolve that he will not move until he realizes the truth. And of course, the Mara, the tempter, comes and tries to tempt him away from his resolve with these very intense experiences, and he remains with his resolve, and then becomes the Buddha. So what does this have to do with self-care? I mean, I've already sort of hinted at it, but now I'll be more explicit about it. So most of us have this distorted view, because it's what we've been taught by the world, that self-care is this avoidance of anything that we find offensive or threatening or fearful. And so we isolate. And of course, this generates a great deal of tension and hostility. So then there's all kinds of war, because there are those out there who are also trying to isolate themselves. But their views of what's offensive and our views of what's offensive differ. So they view us as offensive, and we view them as offensive, and we're encroaching on one another, and there's a breaking point. So then the hostility breaks out. But this basic pattern: withdrawal, isolation, and then the tension builds, and then there's the aggression that comes out of that, and then isolation, withdrawal, and then aggression. So this basic seesaw pattern goes on and on and on, and this is how most people are enduring their existence. So this idea that we're of self-care being avoidance of anything threatening or uncomfortable or unpleasant is false. It's not true self-care. Why? because it's a very superficial understanding, and therefore a misunderstanding of what the self is and what care is. If you identify as this body mind exclusively, you say, I am this exclusively, and I must preserve this at all costs, then of course this is the pattern that will emerge from that, because this is vulnerable. This body mind is vulnerable to all kinds of influences. Of course, the body is very vulnerable, and the mind is very vulnerable because of all the influences. It could be persuaded in all kinds of ways, corrupted in all kinds of ways. So when I identify as this separate body mind exclusively, then my idea of self-care has to be preservation and care of this separate self, which means thereby I have to avoid all the threats, avoid all the discomfort. And so that's a misunderstanding. And I won't belabor the point. I hope it's clear. So then there can be a complete rejection of that, which is illustrated by Siddhartha's rejection of his comfortable palace life, and he goes and lives with the ascetics in the forest and stands on one leg and eats nothing but raw roots or whatever he's eating and starving himself. And so this is sometimes the reaction that comes. Now, this is perhaps not for most of us, or well, in some ways. I mean, we don't go to that external extreme, but in some ways we do that internally. This extreme rejection. And of course, some people do it externally as well. It's not as popular these days as I guess it was in the days of 2,500 years ago. But this is also fundamentally a misunderstanding, because it's saying, well, I misunderstood myself to be this thing, and I was trying to care for it by avoiding all of the fear and discomfort. And so the misunderstanding is, well, I'll reject that by going to the other extreme. Now I'll try to deny all comfort and what I understood as care for this separate self. Still rooted on the notion that I'm this separate body mind exclusively. So both turn out to be superficial. So then we come to what is true self-care. And it's illustrated by Siddhartha's resolve when he sits under the Bodhi tree. So this resolve, this desperation for truth and a resolve for truth is what gives birth to the authentic self-care. Before that time, it's impossible, really, because there'll still be this oscillation between these superficial extremes. But when there's this realization that I've been oscillating between these superficial extremes for at least this whole lifetime, and perhaps countless previous lifetimes, and there's this sort of maturation that occurs, and from that there's this realization that will never work, right? That has to be the realization that it's never worked. It's never worked for anyone. Everybody is making the same fundamental error. It will not work no matter how long I attempt it, no matter how intensely I attempt it, it will never work. And so from that, this desperate desire, this desperate need, like you're truly you realize you're truly starving, not starving just the body, but starving at the soul level, starving for truth, starving to know who you actually are. And this is born out of that realization. So perhaps pause and just see if it's possible for you to have that realization now. It is possible if you just tell the truth, right? If you just notice that I have been, in some ways, oscillating between these extremes. I've been avoiding and then I've been rejecting. All fundamentally based on fear and out of ignorance of my true identity, believing that I am this separate body, mind, exclusively this and only this. I have been making this mistake and it has produced so much suffering. You have to have this realization. So just look and see for yourself the truth of it. See that no matter how long you keep it up, it will never produce a better outcome because it's founded on a fundamental ignorance. And that ignorance, because it's an idea of separation, holds within it this anxiety because there's a sense that you will be destroyed. And it's true. Absolutely true. This separate identity is absolutely guaranteed to be destroyed. In fact, the ignorance runs so deep, the delusion, the hypnosis, that we don't even recognize that it is being destroyed always now. It never actually exists. It's never sustained. It's total delusion that it has any sustenance whatsoever. But at the very least, we can see that if you project into the future, project to your deathbed, if you can imagine such a thing, that moment of death, and recognize if you follow the same path of ignorance, clinging to this false identity, that moment of death will be no different than this moment now. It will be fear, anxiety, and ignorance. And it doesn't matter whether you're at this extreme or that extreme in that moment, because there's still a clinging to the same fundamental ignorance, a delusion about who you are. And so the self-care, whether you're at this extreme and you're desperately trying to avoid all of the discomfort so that you can so-called care for yourself, trying to be comfortable in this false way, or you're rejecting that and at this other extreme, both produce the same outcome, anxiety and fear. So when you have this realization, which hopefully you can have now, then tell the truth. There's this desperate desire for truth, to know who you are. And now there's a possibility of the recognition of what true self-care is, because there's at least a glimpse of the truth of what self is. And so now this self-care is a resolution, a very firm resolution. You have to make this a very firm resolution now, that you won't move from truth. And you make that resolution. And probably when you attempt to make that resolution, you'll see how fickle your mind is and how you probably don't even really believe in the resolution. Maybe you do. In that case, that's wonderful. But most of us, we're we're so cynical, we can't believe in our own resolution. So we need to get clearer on what it really means, because if we think, oh, well, I have to stay immobile, that my resolution has to be to sit under this tree and not move, then of course we're going to have a hard time believing that, because we're very weak, you know. So we're not likely to be able to follow through on that. But if we understand the resolution more clearly, then perhaps we can actually believe in our resolve. So let's get some more clarity on what this really is, what this self-care really means. So it does not mean you have to sit immobile under a tree. But what it does mean is that you have to recognize who you really are, and you have to resolve not to move from that. And even this much might seem difficult because of the habit of identifying with all of these other things. But now let's see about what is the consequence of not following through on this resolve, because it might seem very difficult, but if you see how profoundly painful it is not to follow through on the resolve, then it makes it much easier. So the resolve is to self-care. And maybe you've had a glimpse of what this self is. This is, again, foundational, because if you don't have that, then how are you going to do any authentic self-care if you don't know who this self is? So hopefully you've had that glimpse, but now we maybe need to clarify what the care is. So the care, again, is this resolve to remain with this truth, to remain with yourself, to remain with this authentic openness and love. Because this is, we could say, these are just words, of course, but they point to the nature of the self: openness and love, unconditional, not conditional, of course not. I love you, but I don't love you, or I love you when these conditions are met, but otherwise I'm going to withhold the love. It's not like that. It's complete unconditional love that receives everything. So that no matter what content appears, no matter what thoughts appear, no matter what feelings appear, this unconditional love receives all of it. So notice that a lot of the content is fearful, angry, hostile. And maybe I need to clarify that, because maybe you say, well, I'm not very hostile. I don't have any hostility toward anyone, but check it out. Uh, Even if you think you're not hostile towards others, you're certainly hostile toward your idea of yourself, because you'll say, well, because you know everything about your experience, everything that you've done, everything that you haven't done, everything you've thought. You know all of that. And so you have a certain hostility towards some of that because you say, well, I've done and thought and felt some terrible things. And so there's a hostility, a rejection of some of those things, but there's this cute phrase, which is true: what you resist persists. So if you resist certain things because you say, oh, that's so awful, I can't accept it, then it persists. Why? Just take a look and see. Because again, the fundamental nature is this awareness, aliveness, which I have also described as unconditional love. So its nature is to be infinitely creative and infinitely receptive, right? Awareness is infinitely creative, infinitely receptive. Aliveness is infinitely creative, infinitely receptive. So unconditional love is infinitely creative, infinitely receptive. It doesn't reject anything. That's by definition, it's unconditional. So this resolve is to remain with this unconditional love. And the care is simply to allow and receive everything unconditionally, exactly as it is. Now, notice, maybe again at the mind level that seems very difficult, but hopefully you can see that it to do otherwise is profoundly painful, because then you're putting yourself in this position of being this separate thing that has to manage it all. You've got to manage your behaviors, your actions, your thoughts, your feelings, your self-image, what others are going to perceive about you, what they'll know about you, what you're going to hide. All of it has to be managed by you. And oh boy, isn't that, it's an impossible task. It's like Atlas tasked with holding up the earth, or like Sisyphus who's rolling the boulder up the hill every day. It's just an impossible task. And so when you can see it's impossible and it's so profoundly painful, then perhaps you can start to recognize that authentic self-care is very wonderful, because it is a great unburdening. You don't have to do anything. Maybe it seems like a doing, but of all the doings, it's the best doing. Just see the value in the self as unconditional love, as awareness, aliveness, and just keep putting your attention on that, so that whatever content arises, it's instantly received, instantly fulfilled. Because all the content, there's actually a desire there. It's all desire. Desire doesn't have to be for the $1 million or the Mercedes or the six-pack abs or whatever it is. Desire is just simply it's the creation, is the existence of the phenomenon, right? That it's a curiosity to know itself as this, in this form. Doesn't, it's only in retrospect, in a sense, that there's any judgment of it as good or bad. It's in its purity, and it's just in that explosion of creation. In this instant, there's no judgment. It's simply a desire, and the fulfillment of that desire is in its reception, right? In the resolution, in the fulfillment. That is it. So just to allow all of it. Okay, so that's a very deep level. But now let's see if I can wrap it up and try to make this even more accessible. Just see that all of so many of the things that you try to manage in your life, it's just very painful. So you have these experiences and we all have these experiences, the anger, resentment, fear, jealousy, envy, pride. So, all of these kinds of things. And when you think you've got to do something with it, which is what most of us think we think we've got to do something with it. We've either got to express it, right? The anger wells up and you think, I've got to do something. I've got to let them know how angry I am. I've got to make the change out there. Got to get it done. Or we bottle it up and suppress it. You think, oh, it's so awful. And then you give yourself an ulcer or cancer or something. Or at the very least, insomnia or indigestion. But it's to see that you don't need to do either of those. Because neither of those give you the outcome that you want. The outcome, you want to feel good. The jealousy happens and you just ruminate, scheme, plot, right? No matter what you do with that, you hurt. There's no good that comes from it. So to see that you don't need to do anything with it. And in fact, you should not do anything with it, because whether you try to express it or suppress it, either way, it's just bad. And it's bad not because the thing itself is bad. It's not that the anger or the jealousy or the pride or the envy or any of those things are actually inherently bad. It's just that it's actually just aliveness, and it wants to experience itself and receive itself. It's like this big secret that this life is, as I said, is infinitely creative and infinitely receptive, and it's both. It's not like the creative aspect is to be creating and extending forever and sustaining forever, just to build up this big thing forever. It's actually to create and receive, right? It's to receive its own creation. And this is just it's your very nature. It's what's happening all the time. But again, we get caught up and diluted, and then we're trying to manage it all, and we hurt. So that's the big secret. And then the obstacles are just the fear and the beliefs. So I'm not saying that it's always easy. It's like Siddhartha sitting under the Bodhi tree, then Mara comes and tempts him. And how are we tempted? Just observe your experience and you'll see. Everybody's got a slightly unique makeup. So for you, it will be slightly different from somebody else, but It's power, fear, lust. And it just comes down to those things, right? And so just see that it really is just those things. And you just have to tell the truth and see, yes, but it's painful, right? The fear comes and the fear says, if you don't do something with this, if you don't manage it, if you don't fix it, then something really terrible is going to happen and you're going to be in so much pain, suffer so badly. And you just have to tell the truth, which is, wait a second, but I have been doing something for lifetimes and I am suffering and in pain as a result. So then it brings you back to the resolve, right? Just to see, to tell the truth, which is that the deception is that I will suffer and be in pain if I don't take this action and try to manage it. But the truth is that by trying to manage it, it's only produced the suffering and pain. So the one thing is certain, there's a certain outcome, which is that if I try to manage this, I will suffer and experience pain. There's an unknown. What if I don't try to manage it? And that's where the risk is, right? But see that it's absolutely insane to do the thing, to be compelled and indulge that compulsion to do the thing that has the certain outcome of suffering and pain. So take the big risk. Actually practice self-care. Acknowledge the self. Remain with the self as unconditional love and simply receive the creation. Just receive. And maybe it doesn't end. Maybe the fear comes back again and again and again. And maybe the lust comes again and again and again. Okay. Maybe it's forever. But the insanity of doing the thing that has the certain outcome of pain and suffering has to be seen. And then take the risk. Be willing to surrender to the unknown, because that's the self-care. So I hope that this has been clear and that you have had the direct experience and realized for yourself what has been pointed to. And then I hope that you will follow through on your resolve for self-care, authentic self-care. And for those who are here live, I'm happy to stay on for Q&A in the event that there happen to be any questions. I'm going to end this recording now.